Every man feared him, every empire hunted him, and yet every sailor dreamed of standing where he stood. To be a pirate captain was to live like a king one day and die like a criminal the next. Tonight, we uncover the truth of what it really meant to command a ship of rogues. To picture the life of a pirate captain, we must first understand where these men, and sometimes women, came from. Contrary to romantic tales, they were rarely born into power. Instead, they clawed their way up from the bottom, often beginning as poor sailors, laborers, or even indentured servants. The sea was the one place where birth and bloodlines mattered less than skill, courage, and the willingness to seize opportunity when it came. The story of a pirate captain's rise usually begins not with gold, but with hardship. Many of them first served aboard merchant ships, sweating under the command of brutal officers. Discipline on merchant or naval vessels was notoriously harsh. Floggings, starvation rations, and unpaid wages were common. For some men, piracy was not rebellion against order, but rebellion against cruelty. To leap from an oppressed sailor to a pirate was to choose freedom, however dangerous, over servitude. In that leap, the seeds of future captains were planted. Some rose by mutiny. In the cramped and storm-tossed quarters of a ship, discipline depended on the authority of the officers. But authority could be fragile. When crews grew weary of whips and empty bellies, they sometimes turned on their masters. Mutinies might end in chaos, with men adrift or captured, but now and then one sailor stepped forward with the charisma and courage to hold the crew together. If he could guide them to safety, and if he could win their loyalty, that man might become captain. These moments of sudden revolt created leaders out of ordinary men. Others came into command more deliberately. During the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, pirates often elected their captains. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of naval life, pirate ships embraced a rough form of democracy. When a crew decided to turn pirate, they would vote on who should lead them. The chosen captain was not always the strongest fighter or the loudest voice, but the one the crew trusted to deliver plunder and survival. His power depended on their faith in him, and if he failed too often, they could strip him of his command just as quickly. Some captains began their careers not as mutineers, but as privateers. During times of war, governments issued letters of marque, giving private ships the legal right to raid enemy commerce. These captains, sanctioned by crowns and parliaments, were pirates in all but name. When wars ended and those letters were revoked, many found themselves unemployed. Their skills, navigation, gunnery, intimidation, were too valuable to waste, and their taste for plunder too strong to give up. So they turned to piracy, bringing with them the discipline and knowledge of professional sea commanders. Henry Morgan, one of the most infamous buccaneers, began his career this way. Yet even the most skilled captain needed more than charts and cannons to lead. He needed charisma, that rare ability to inspire rough men to follow him into danger. On a pirate ship, the crew was not bound by law or nation, but by choice. Loyalty had to be earned. A captain who demanded obedience without respect would not last long. Tales abound of pirate captains who ruled harshly, only to be overthrown, marooned, or killed by their own men. Successful captains balanced authority with fairness, mixing discipline with the promise of wealth and freedom. A pirate captain's rise was as much about reputation as it was about skill. Stories traveled faster than ships. A sailor who proved himself bold in boarding actions or clever in ambushes might gain the admiration of his fellows. A man who stood unflinching in storms, or who shared his share of loot generously, could build loyalty before ever holding command. In many cases, a captain was a leader long before he bore the title. The crew merely recognized what was already true. Of course, not every captain rose cleanly. Some clawed their way into power through sheer brutality. Blackbeard, perhaps the most legendary pirate of them all, was not elected for kindness. He seized his reputation through terror, weaving his image into a living nightmare with smoking fuses in his beard and a pistol in each hand. Men followed him partly out of awe, partly out of fear, and partly because his daring raids brought them fortune. Blackbeard's rise demonstrates another truth about pirate captains. There was no single path to command, only opportunity and the nerve to seize it. But beneath all the different stories, mutiny, election, privateering, terror, lay a common theme: necessity. Piracy was not a career chosen by the privileged, but a gamble made by the desperate, the brave, and the ambitious. Captains emerged because someone had to lead, someone had to chart the course and decide when to fight or flee. In the chaos of pirate life, leadership was not an inheritance, but a role seized by those bold enough to wear it. And so the pirate captain stood apart from the men he led, not by birth, not by law, but by choice, courage, and the fragile weight of trust. His rise was never simple, never secure, but for those who could hold command, even for a fleeting moment, it was power beyond the dreams of common sailors. If the life of a pirate captain was filled with burdens and dangers, it also came with privileges, none more symbolic than the captain's cabin. On most ships, space was precious. Dozens, sometimes more than 100 men, shared the cramped, swaying darkness of the lower deck. They slept shoulder to shoulder in hammocks, rocked by the sea, with rats and damp planks for company. Yet, tucked away at the stern, often with windows that opened to the rolling waves, the captain's quarters stood as a world apart. But to imagine luxury here would be to mislead. This was no palace on the water. A pirate captain's cabin was larger than the crew's space, yes, but only by comparison. It was often little more than a single chamber, panelled in rough wood, its boards groaning with every wave. Still, compared to the filth and sweat of the lower deck, it seemed like another universe. It was a place of light, privacy, and, most importantly, authority. Step inside, and the first thing you might notice would be the desk or table. For a captain, this was the heart of his command. Maps and charts sprawled across its surface, held down by stones or knives to keep them from sliding. Here, the captain plotted raids, charted courses, and calculated their position with compass and astrolabe. By candlelight, with the ship creaking beneath him, he would trace the outlines of distant coasts, searching for targets rich in gold or silver, or plotting safe havens to escape the ever-hunting navy. For a man who bore responsibility for dozens of lives, this desk was not just furniture. It was the burden of leadership laid out in ink and parchment. Nearby, shelves or chests often groaned with instruments of navigation, compasses, dividers, sand glasses, and sometimes more exotic tools. A captain's cabin doubled as the brain of the ship, a space where mathematics and superstition mixed freely. Few captains were trained navigators in the formal sense, but those who could read the stars, feel the winds, and keep a steady course gained respect and fear. A single miscalculation could send them into shoals, storms, or the jaws of the navy. Every chart laid out on the captain's table was a gamble with fate. And then, of course, there were the weapons. No pirate captain was ever far from steel or gunpowder. Pistols, short, heavy, and often unreliable, might be displayed on the wall or kept loaded on the desk. Cutlasses hung within reach, their blades nicked and notched from use. Some captains adorned their quarters with captured flags, or grim trophies taken from their enemies. Blackbeard was known to keep an arsenal close at hand, while others displayed plundered trinkets, gilded goblets, jewel-studded pistols, or the fine silk scarves of defeated foes. These objects were more than decoration. They were symbols of authority, reminders to any who entered the cabin that the man within was master of the ship. Yet, despite these tokens of power, The cabin also bore the marks of constant hardship. The air was thick with the smell of tar, salt, and smoke. Candles guttered in the draughts that slipped through the planks. In rough seas, water might seep through the timbers, soaking clothes and charts alike. Rats were just as likely to visit the captain's quarters as they were the hold. A hammock or cot provided rest, but the mattress was often little more than stuffed canvas. Privacy existed here, but comfort was fleeting. Still, there were small luxuries. A captain's cabin might have a chair with a cushion, an unthinkable indulgence for the men outside. A bottle of fine wine, seized from a merchantman, might rest on the desk, to be sipped slowly while planning the next raid. Exotic trinkets, shells, idols, or curiosities from distant shores sometimes adorned the shelves, testaments to voyages that spanned oceans. Compared to the filth of the lower decks, these small treasures gave the captain's quarters a sense of refinement, however modest. The cabin was also a stage. When outsiders, merchants, prisoners, or even fellow pirates were invited in, they were meant to be impressed, even intimidated. The weapons on display, the maps, the trophies of conquest, all were carefully arranged to send a message. This was not just a sailor's room, but the chamber of a commander. Even the view through the stern windows, waves rolling endlessly into the horizon, gave the captain an aura of authority, as if he alone stood at the edge of the known world, guiding the ship through chaos. It was also, paradoxically, a prison of sorts. For all its privacy, the captain's cabin could feel isolating. The crew shared songs, laughter, and quarrels in their hammocks, but the captain, in his solitary quarters, bore the loneliness of command. When storms raged, or when the hunt for prey dragged on too long, he sat alone with his maps, the weight of expectation pressing down like the sea itself. If he failed, it was his name that would be cursed, his head that might be demanded. The cabin's walls, meant to shelter him, often felt like they closed in, sealing him off from the very men who had chosen him. Famous captains left their mark on their cabins. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was said to keep his quarters clean and orderly, reflecting his discipline. Blackbeard's cabin was more chaotic, filled with weapons and smoke, reflecting his terrifying presence. Calico Jack Rackham, famed more for style than success, reportedly decorated his quarters with bright fabrics, stolen from Caribbean merchants. In each case, the cabin was not just a room. It was an extension of the captain's character, a mirror of the way he ruled. For the crew, the captain's cabin was both a mystery and a symbol. Most pirates rarely entered it. To step inside was to enter the very heart of power, a reminder of the fine line between democracy and authority. The cabin stood as both prize and burden, a place where the dreams of riches and freedom were plotted, but also where paranoia and sleepless nights brewed. To command a ship was to command from this wooden chamber, caught between the roar of the sea and the restless demands of the men who sailed upon it. And so, the captain's cabin was never just a room. It was a throne, a council chamber, a war room, and a sanctuary all in one. To be invited inside was to glimpse the strange contradiction of pirate leadership, power wrapped in fragility, freedom bound by endless responsibility. For a pirate captain, every plank and every candle flame within that space was a reminder of the life he had chosen, glorious, dangerous, and always just one storm away from ruin. When people imagine a pirate captain, they often picture an absolute ruler, a man whose word was law, commanding obedience at the point of a pistol. In truth, the reality was far stranger and more fascinating. Pirate ships were among the most democratic societies of their age, and captains wielded their authority not as kings, but as servants of the crew's will. Leadership existed, but it was fragile, conditional, and always subject to the restless tides of democracy at sea. On a naval or merchant ship, Power flowed in only one direction. The captain, appointed by owners or the crown, ruled with near total authority. Orders were to be obeyed without question, enforced by the whip if necessary. But when sailors turned pirate, they carried with them bitter memories of this oppression. Many had lived under captains who grew fat while their crews starved, or who pocketed profits while sailors went unpaid. For these men, piracy was not only rebellion against nations, but rebellion against tyranny afloat. And so, when they carved out their new lives, they built ships run on radically different principles. The pirate captain was elected. This fact alone was revolutionary. The crew chose their leader, not because of noble birth or royal appointment, but because they believed he could deliver plunder and survival. The captain's authority lasted only as long as the men desired it. A single bad raid, a series of unlucky voyages, or a whiff of cowardice could see him stripped of command. In some cases, the crew voted to replace their captain mid-voyage, casting him down and elevating another in his place. This democracy did not mean disorder. Pirate ships were bound together by the Articles, a set of rules drawn up and agreed upon before each voyage. These articles spelled out how loot would be divided, how disputes would be settled, and how discipline would be enforced. Crucially, they also defined the limits of the captain's power. In battle, the captain commanded absolutely. His orders were law, for hesitation in combat meant death. But in matters of daily life, where to sail, what ships to attack, how supplies were shared, the crew often had the final word. At the captain's side stood the quartermaster, perhaps the most powerful figure on a pirate ship besides the captain himself. The quartermaster served as a counterbalance to the captain's authority. He managed the distribution of loot, settled disputes among the crew, and acted as the crew's voice when grievances arose. If the captain symbolized courage and strategy, the quartermaster symbolized fairness and accountability. Together, they formed the backbone of pirate governance, a strange duet of authority and democracy. The tension between captain and crew could be dramatic. Pirate history is filled with stories of captains who pushed too far and paid the price. Charles Vane, for instance, was deposed by his men after a string of failures and replaced by the more reliable Calico Jack Rackham. Even Blackbeard, the fearsome legend himself, relied heavily on the consent of his men. His terrifying theatrics may have been as much for his crew's benefit as for his enemies. The lesson was simple. No matter how fearsome or cunning, a captain who lost the trust of his crew lost everything. This balance of power gave pirate crews a strange sense of equality rarely found on land in the 17th and 18th centuries. Men who might have been peasants or slaves found themselves with a voice in decisions. Votes were taken openly, disputes argued loudly, and every man aboard knew he had some measure of control over his fate. It was a rough democracy, fueled by rum, tempered by violence. But it was democracy nonetheless. For men denied justice in the world of kings and merchants, it was intoxicating. Yet, democracy at sea did not mean softness. Pirate captains were expected to be decisive, ruthless when necessary, and bold in pursuit of prize ships. Cowardice was despised above all. A captain who shirked battle or fled too often would quickly find his men whispering mutiny. At the same time, cruelty could not cross certain lines. While pirates were often brutal to prisoners or enemies, within their own ranks they demanded fairness. A captain who hoarded treasure or abused his authority was courting disaster. The crew's justice was swift and often merciless, marooning, flogging, or worse. Famous pirate articles give us glimpses of how this balance worked in practice. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, enforced a strict code where even gambling had to be regulated to prevent discord. Henry Morgan's articles ensured fair shares of loot, with compensation for wounds. A lost eye or limb entitled a man to extra payment. These rules were not merely suggestions, they were contracts, binding captain and crew alike. To break them, was to risk the wrath of the very men who had raised the captain up. For all its fragility, this system worked. Pirate ships, though small and hunted, could be astonishingly effective. Their captains, empowered yet restrained by the will of their men, often proved daring strategists. Their crews, knowing they had a voice, fought with a ferocity unmatched by the pressed sailors of the navy. A pirate captain ruled not by fear of punishment, but by the promise of reward, and by the constant reminder that his crown was borrowed, not earned. In the end, the authority of a pirate captain was unlike any other in the world. He was at once a commander and a servant, a master and a hostage to the moods of his men. His power was absolute in the thunder of battle, but fragile in the quiet of daily life. He was a leader who ruled not from divine right, but from the shifting sands of trust and democracy. And for all its contradictions, this strange balance of freedom and authority gave piracy its peculiar strength, a strength that terrified empires and immortalized its captains in legend. To many, the word pirate conjures images of wild lawlessness, a crew of cutthroats, drunk on rum, doing as they please beneath the Jolly Roger. Yet the truth is almost the opposite. Pirate ships, for all their violence and chaos, were governed by rules, strict, detailed, and enforced with surprising consistency. These rules, known as the Articles of Agreement, or simply the Pirate Code, formed the backbone of pirate society. They defined not only how loot was shared, but how justice, discipline, and even daily life were maintained aboard a ship. In an age when kings and merchants ruled with iron fists, pirate crews turned to contracts. Before embarking on a voyage, the crew gathered, often on deck, rum in hand, and agreed upon a set of articles. These were not dictated by the captain alone, but negotiated and accepted by all. Once signed, often with marks or initials from men who could not write, the articles bound everyone on board, captain and sailor alike. In many ways, this was one of the earliest forms of workplace democracy, a social contract afloat on the lawless sea. The most important element of the code was the division of plunder. Pirates were not fools. They knew men fought hardest when they believed the rewards were fair. Under most articles, the captain received a double or triple share of the loot, enough to reflect his responsibilities and risks. The quartermaster took a share nearly equal to the captain, for he too carried heavy duties. The rest of the crew divided the spoils equally, whether they were cannon-laden gunners or lowly deckhands. Compared to merchant service, where officers grew rich while sailors starved, this equality was revolutionary. But fairness went beyond gold. Many codes included provisions for injury. A man who lost an arm in battle, or an eye from a splintered cannon shot, received compensation, sometimes hundreds of pieces of eight. These payments, drawn from the collective plunder, ensured that wounded men could survive when they could no longer fight. It was a crude form of insurance, long before governments ever dreamed of such things. For sailors who had once been discarded by navies without a second thought, this was a powerful promise. The code also governed behavior. Gambling, for instance, was often forbidden aboard ship. Quarrels that spilled into violence were punished swiftly, for nothing endangered a voyage more than discord among the crew. Weapons were to be kept clean and ready, powder dry and secure. Lights and candles had to be put out at a set hour to prevent fire aboard the wooden vessel. Even smoking was regulated, confined to specific places. These were not rules for comfort. They were rules for survival. Punishments for breaking the code were harsh. A thief caught stealing from the common pot might lose an ear, or be marooned on a barren shore with nothing but a pistol and powder. Cowards who shirked battle could suffer flogging or worse. And traitors, men who plotted with the enemy or sought to betray their fellows for pardon, were met with no mercy. Pirates could be merciful to prisoners, but rarely to one another when the code was broken. Justice had to be swift and terrible, for the crew's trust depended on it. Yet the code was not merely about discipline, it also defined rights. Each man had a say in important decisions, from choosing targets to electing officers. Musicians, when present, were given rest on the Sabbath, their instruments silent by rule. Some codes even protected the spoils of personal adventure. If a man gambled ashore and won a fortune, it was his to keep. These articles transformed the pirate ship from a mob of rogues into a community bound by shared laws. Different captains had different articles, and their codes reflected their personalities. Bartholomew Roberts, called Black Bart, had one of the most detailed. His code forbade gambling, ordered lights out by 8, and demanded every man keep his weapons ready. He allowed duels to settle disputes, but only on shore, with pistols. Roberts was a disciplinarian, and his articles reveal a ship run with near-military precision. By contrast, captains like Edward Lowe were notorious for cruelty, and their codes often mirrored this brutality. On his ship, punishments were vicious, designed to spread fear as much as enforce discipline. The balance between fairness and tyranny could shift depending on who wore the captain's coat. The code also reinforced the strange mix of freedom and order that defined piracy. On land, most of these men had no rights at all. They were laborers, peasants, convicts, or enslaved people, their voices ignored by kings and governors. At sea, under the black flag, they suddenly found themselves part of a contract where every man's voice mattered. The articles gave them a kind of equality unheard of in their world. Equality backed by violence, but equality nonetheless. Perhaps the most striking thing about the code is that it worked. Pirate crews were famously loyal, not because they were bound by law, but because they believed in the fairness of their system. A man who risked his life knew that his share of the spoils was secure. A man who lost a leg knew he would not be abandoned. And all knew that their leaders could be challenged, even replaced, if they failed in their duty. The pirate code was no romantic fiction. It was a living, breathing constitution, written in ink, enforced in blood, and remembered in legend. It gave order to chaos, unity to rebellion, and strength to ships that might otherwise have torn themselves apart. For the pirate captain, it was both shield and sword, the very foundation of his authority. Without it, he was just another rogue at sea. With it, he stood at the head of a brotherhood bound by law, even in a world without law. If the pirate code gave a ship its order, then strategy and navigation gave it direction. For a captain, few duties were heavier than choosing where to sail, which ships to hunt, and how to escape the endless dangers of the sea. To command a pirate vessel was not simply to wave a cutlass and roar in battle. It was to carry the maps, calculate the winds, and gamble with the lives of every man aboard. Unlike naval officers, who were trained in mathematics and astronomy, most pirate captains were self-taught sailors. They had learned by experience, long years at sea, watching the stars, feeling the roll of the waves, studying the signs of weather on the horizon. A skilled captain could tell the approach of a storm from the shape of clouds, or sense the nearness of land from the flight of seabirds. Navigation was as much instinct as science, though tools of the trade gave pirates their edge. On the captain's table lay the instruments of command. The compass, the most essential of all, gave direction even when skies were black. Sand glasses measured the passage of time, turned hour after hour to judge speed and distance. Dividers and charts allowed the plotting of courses, though maps were often crude, riddled with errors, and sometimes little more than sketches copied from others. The astrolabe and cross-staff, though complicated, gave glimpses of latitude by the stars or sun, though few pirates mastered them as well as naval navigators. Still, what pirates lacked in precision, they often made up in daring. Strategy for a pirate captain was not simply about reaching a destination, it was about choosing prey. Merchant routes were the lifeblood of piracy. Ships laden with sugar, tobacco, rum, silver, or slaves plied the seas, and captains learned to haunt the waters where traffic was thickest. The windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola became a favorite hunting ground. So too did the approaches to Port Royal, Nassau, and the Chesapeake. Pirates also lurked along the coast of West Africa, preying on slavers bound for the Americas. To know the rhythms of trade was to hold the key to plunder. But hunting carried its own dangers. A captain who chose unwisely might find his crew facing not a fat merchantman, but a heavily armed escort. Navies patrolled the seas with increasing ferocity, and privateers sailed under false flags, luring pirates to their doom. Every decision was a roll of the dice. Attack the wrong ship, and the voyage could end in disaster. Wait too long without prey, and the crew's rumblings might turn to mutiny. For a captain, the sea was a chessboard, and every move risked checkmate. Navigation also meant managing the winds themselves. In the age of sail, mastery of the trade winds was everything. The Atlantic was a vast machine of currents and breezes, its patterns known only to those who studied them. A captain had to understand the great gyres that carried ships across oceans, the steady trades blowing west, the westerlies that pushed back east, the dangerous calms of the doldrums. To misjudge them was to risk being becalmed for weeks, water dwindling, tempers flaring. To harness them well was to appear uncanny, a master of the very elements. Night brought both fear and guidance. Under clear skies, captains read the heavens like a book. The North Star gave direction, while constellations traced invisible paths across the black. Men who could not read words could still read stars, and the best captains turned this knowledge into power. The crew, watching their leader stand at the stern, eyes lifted to the night sky, felt a mixture of awe and dependence. For them, the captain's ability to steer through darkness was proof of destiny. Of course, not all relied on skill alone. Deception played its role in strategy. Pirates often flew false flags, hoisting the colors of friendly nations to lure merchants closer before revealing the dreaded black. Captains also staged clever tricks, hiding most of the crew below decks to make their vessel seem harmless, or feigning damage to draw in curious rescuers. These ruses, risky as they were, gave small pirate ships the edge against larger prey. When pursuit came, as it often did, navigation became a matter of survival. A captain who knew hidden coves, reefs, and shoals could escape pursuers that dared not risk their heavy ships. Narrow inlets, shallow waters, and sudden storms were allies to the cunning. Many pirate captains built their reputations not only on bold raids, but on miraculous escapes, vanishing into coastal labyrinths where no navy dared follow. Famous captains showed the importance of strategy time and again. Henry Morgan, though later a governor, built his fortune on carefully planned raids, striking at Panama with precision. Bartholomew Roberts, famed for capturing over 400 ships, was a master of positioning, placing his vessels where trade flowed thickest. Even Blackbeard, with all his bluster, was shrewd in choosing when and where to fight, using his fearsome image as part of his strategy. Behind every daring tale lay a mind calculating risks, weighing options, and gambling on the sea's endless uncertainties. But strategy also carried loneliness. While the crew drank and gambled, it was the captain who sat hunched over maps, tracing routes by flickering candlelight. The men could jeer if the voyage went poorly, but they did not share the burden of command. Only the captain knew the gnawing fear of leading men into danger, of wondering whether tomorrow's dawn would bring victory or ruin. Every choice carved his reputation and his fate. In the end, navigation was not just about reaching a place, it was about survival. A pirate captain who lost his way risked more than embarrassment. He risked hunger, thirst, and death for all aboard. One wrong course could leave them stranded without wind, supplies dwindling as despair set in. One clever route could deliver them to rich prey and overflowing plunder. The line between triumph and disaster was as thin as a chart line scratched in ink. So when you picture a pirate captain, imagine not just the cutlass and the pistol, but the compass and the chart. Imagine him standing at the stern in the dead of night, eyes on the stars, whispering calculations as the waves crash below. For it was not brute strength alone that made a captain, but the delicate art of strategy and navigation, an art upon which every pirate life depended. For all the glamour that legends drape upon pirate captains, the daring raids, the gold and silver, the fearsome reputations, they bore a weight that few envied, the burden of command. To sit in the captain's place was not simply to enjoy privilege, it was to live under constant pressure, to balance the hunger of the crew with the dangers of the sea, and to carry responsibility for every decision made aboard. In truth, the captain's life was often lonelier, harsher, and more dangerous than that of the men he led. Unlike common sailors, who could curse their luck and dream of desertion, the captain had no such escape. He was bound to his role by choice and by expectation. Every eye on the ship looked to him for answers: where to sail, when to fight, when to flee. If food ran short, the crew blamed him. If storms scattered the sails, they muttered about his judgment. And if raids went poorly, it was his name whispered in anger. A sailor could hide in the shadows of the mast, but the captain lived always under the open sky of scrutiny. The burden was magnified by the peculiar democracy of pirate ships. Unlike naval captains, who ruled by decree, pirate captains served at the pleasure of their crews. His crown was not of gold, but of votes. Should he falter too often, should his decisions appear cowardly or reckless, the crew could strip him of command in a moment. Many a once feared captain found himself abandoned or replaced by the very men who had once cheered his name. The constant threat of deposition hung like a noose around the captain's neck. This fragile authority forced captains into a delicate dance. Too harsh, and the men resented him. Too lenient, and discipline crumbled. Too cautious, and he was branded a coward. Too bold, and the crew might perish in a hopeless fight. Each decision was a tightrope stretched over mutiny, and only the sure-footed could cross it. Few occupations demanded so much balance between leadership and survival. The daily grind of command was relentless. At dawn, while others still roused themselves with grumbling and grog, the captain was already awake, scanning the horizon for sails or storms. He consulted the charts, checked the wind, and issued orders for the day's course. He met with the quartermaster to discuss provisions, the boatswain to consider repairs, and the gunners to inspect powder and shot. Though his share of loot was greater than a common sailor's, he earned it in sweat and sleeplessness. In times of danger, the burden grew heavier still. When a strange sail appeared, all eyes turned to the captain. Was it prey to be hunted, or a predator to be avoided? The wrong choice could mean riches, or ruin. In battle, he stood exposed, pistol in hand, barking orders through smoke and cannon fire. If he faltered, if his voice wavered or his courage cracked, panic could ripple through the crew like lightning. A pirate captain had to embody fearlessness, even when terror gnawed at his own heart. Then there was the burden of justice. Disputes were constant on a ship of hard men. Quarrels over loot, grudges over insults, jealousies, and simmering rivalries, all threatened to erupt into violence. While the quartermaster often mediated, it was the captain who had to stand as final arbiter. Punishments for theft or cowardice were brutal, and it fell to the captain to order them. To send a man to the lash, to maroon him on a barren shore, or worse, these decisions weighed heavily, even on hardened souls. Every punishment risked resentment, but every act of mercy risked disorder. The captain also carried the burden of secrecy. Many of his decisions could not be explained in the moment. He might order a detour to avoid a patrol, risking hunger while the crew cursed his caution. He might refuse to attack a fat-looking merchantman, because he suspected it carried hidden cannons. These judgments, born of experience, often went unappreciated until long after. The captain knew that his men would judge him by results, not reasons. Until then, he bore their suspicion in silence, and looming over it all was the knowledge that he was the first target in battle. Naval captains and privateers knew that killing or capturing the pirate leader could scatter the crew. A pirate captain's distinctive coat, hat, or banner made him an obvious mark for musket balls and grape shot. Some captains, like Blackbeard, leaned into this, making themselves terrifying icons, gambling that their image would cow enemies before they ever had to fight. But the risk was real. To be a captain was to live constantly in the crosshairs. Beyond the battlefield, the burden stretched into the captain's very identity. On land, he could never truly rest. Every port visit brought spies and bounty hunters. Every tavern toast was shadowed by the thought of betrayal. The crew could melt into anonymity, posing as humble sailors. But the captain's name and face were etched into wanted posters. He was hunted not just as a pirate, but as a leader, an example to be made of. For all these burdens, why did men seek the role? The answer lay in the strange allure of power and freedom. To be a pirate captain was to stand above ordinary men, to command their loyalty, to steer the course of one's own fate. The risks were crushing, but the rewards, gold, fame, and a place in legend, were irresistible. Some captains relished the responsibility, their charisma thriving under pressure. Others were broken by it, remembered only as footnotes in the chronicles of the sea. Perhaps the greatest burden of all was the solitude. For all the camaraderie of ship life, the captain was apart. He dined in his cabin, strategized alone, bore secrets he could not share. When storms raged or mutiny whispered, there was no one to lean on, no superior to consult. The loneliness of command haunted many, a silent weight heavier than any chest of treasure. And so, the figure of the pirate captain emerges not just as a swashbuckler, but as a man beset by trials. His was a crown of storm clouds, his throne a creaking deck, his scepter a sword that cut both ways. He was cheered when fortune smiled, cursed when it turned sour, and hunted by kings no matter the outcome. The burden of command was his constant companion, one that defined his life, shaped his legend, and too often hastened his fall. Steel rusts, gunpowder runs dry, and gold slips through greedy fingers. But reputation, that most intangible of treasures, was a weapon that endured. For pirate captains, fear was not merely a byproduct of their trade, but a carefully honed tool, sharper than any cutlass. To terrify an enemy before a single shot was fired was the mark of a master. It saved powder, preserved lives, and spread a captain's name like wildfire across the seas. From the moment a captain took command, reputation became both shield and sword. Merchant crews, hearing whispers of his name, might surrender without a fight. Governors, quaking at his approach, might offer bribes or pardons to spare their ports. Even his own men, ever prone to discontent, were steadied by the knowledge that they followed a figure feared across oceans. Without reputation, a captain was merely another rogue at sea. With it, he became a legend. Take, for instance, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. By all accounts, his fearsome reputation was more carefully crafted than his actual deeds. He tied slow-burning fuses into his great black beard, lighting them before battle so that smoke and sparks wreathed his head like some devil of the deep. His eyes, wild and piercing, glowed through the haze, and his massive frame was draped in belts of pistols. To sailors seeing him emerge from the smoke, he was no man at all, but a nightmare come alive. Many ships surrendered at the mere sight of him, preferring captivity to facing such a phantom of death. Bartholomew Roberts, called Black Bart, wielded fear in another fashion. Where Blackbeard was theatrical, Roberts was ruthless. He took hundreds of ships in his career, and word of his efficiency spread like fire in dry grass. He enforced discipline with an iron hand and brooked no defiance. Captains who resisted were often executed, their corpses displayed as warnings to others. The sight of Roberts' flag, a skeleton holding an hourglass, pointing at a bleeding heart, was enough to drain the courage from hardened sailors. His reputation was so great that some merchant crews mutinied against their own officers rather than face him in combat. Reputation extended beyond battle. The captain's image was cultivated in every gesture, every word. To his men, he had to appear unflinching, immune to fear. Even in private, when doubts gnawed at his heart, he could never let weakness slip. A captain who trembled before a storm, or who hesitated when danger loomed, risked more than the day's outcome. He risked unraveling the myth that held his crew together. In this sense, the burden of command, as we saw before, intertwined with the weapon of fear. Flags played a vital role in this theatre of terror. The Jolly Roger was not a single design, but a collection of symbols. Skulls, crossed bones, bleeding hearts, hourglasses, even whole skeletons. Each flag spoke of death, time, and doom. When a pirate ship hoisted its black flag, it was a message: surrender quickly or face slaughter. Captains often carried multiple flags, choosing which to fly based on the situation. A red flag, known as the Bloody Banner, meant no quarter would be given. Every man aboard the enemy ship would die. This psychological warfare often ended battles before they began. Reputation also carried across oceans through rumor and story. Sailors were great storytellers, and ports were hives of gossip. A captain's name spread with every captured ship, every tale of cruelty or cunning. Sometimes these stories were exaggerated, even invented. But exaggeration was an ally. The more monstrous the legend, the less likely a crew was to resist. In this way, pirate captains became both men and myths, half human, half demon, in the imaginations of those who feared them. Yet reputation was a double-edged sword. The greater the name, the greater the bounty on the captain's head. Naval squadrons hunted notorious pirates with particular zeal, for kings wished to make examples of them. A captain too infamous could find no safe harbor, no ally willing to risk sheltering him. Fame drew both surrendering merchants and relentless pursuers. Blackbeard himself discovered this when the governor of Virginia sent a specially outfitted expedition to hunt him down, ending his life in a bloody battle. Some captains wielded their reputation sparingly, blending terror with unexpected mercy. This, too, was strategic. If every captured crew expected torture, they might fight desperately. But if word spread that surrender meant survival, many merchantmen lowered their flags without a shot. Captains like Charles Vane and Edward England balanced fear with pragmatism, ensuring their reputations worked for them rather than against them. The captain's personal appearance mattered as much as his deeds. Fine clothes, plumed hats, and silken sashes gave the impression of power and command. Pistols and cutlasses bristling from belts showed readiness for violence. Some captains adopted flamboyant styles, strutting the deck like actors upon a stage. Others chose grim austerity, letting silence and a cold stare inspire dread. Whatever the method, the goal was the same: to project authority so absolute that none dared challenge it. Within the crew, reputation served another purpose. Pirates were equal in many ways, but the captain had to be set apart, not just by authority, but by aura. His reputation was the glue that bound their loyalty. A captain who failed in this regard was not merely unpopular, he was vulnerable. Stories abound of captains overthrown, marooned, or even killed by their own men when their mystique crumbled. Fear, then, was not only for enemies, but for allies. At sea, where survival hung by threads, fear was a currency more reliable than gold. A single glance at a fearsome captain, a single glimpse of the black flag, could turn the tide of battle before blood was shed. Reputation saved lives, earned riches, and etched names into history. And though swords dulled, pistols misfired, and powder spoiled, the power of reputation never faltered. In the end, the greatest captains knew this truth. Their most enduring weapon was not the steel in their hands, but the terror in their enemies' hearts. To be remembered as a figure of dread was to achieve a kind of immortality, and so they cultivated fear, polished it, and wielded it like the sharpest cutlass. Thus, when you imagine the pirate captain, see not only the roaring man with pistol aloft, but the shadowed figure whose name sent shivers across oceans. His true power was not merely in what he did, but in what men believed he could do, and belief, fueled by fear, was the strongest weapon of all. If fear and reputation were a captain's weapons, then plunder was his currency. Gold, silver, sugar, rum, tobacco, silks, spices, these were the prizes that drove men to piracy, and none reaped greater rewards than the captain. Yet the truth was not as simple as one might imagine. Though captains took a larger share than common sailors, their wealth was bound by custom, law, and expectation. To command a pirate crew was to live in a world where riches flowed quickly, but vanished just as fast. The pirate code, that curious democracy of the sea, governed the division of spoils. After every successful raid, the captured goods were gathered and accounted for, whether coins, cargo, or ships themselves. The quartermaster, trusted by the crew as a balance to the captain's power, oversaw this process. Then came the division. The captain's share was larger than any other man's, but it was rarely obscene. A typical code might grant him 2 or 3 shares, sometimes as many as 5, while the average sailor received 1. This meant that while the captain profited more handsomely than his men, he was far from the unchecked despot of romantic tales. His reward was earned, not imposed. The crew accepted his larger portion as payment for the greater burdens he bore, the risks of leadership, the sleepless nights, the responsibility for strategy, and the danger of being first into battle. Without this tacit agreement, his authority would crumble. The spoils themselves came in many forms. Coin was the simplest, but often the least common. Far more often, pirates captured trade goods, casks of rum, barrels of sugar, rolls of tobacco, bolts of silk, even mundane items like tools, clothing, or medicine. These were sold at black markets or pirate-friendly ports, their value divided into coin before distribution. Sometimes the loot was so impractical that it was used immediately, rum consumed, silks worn as trophies, tobacco smoked in long, lazy pipes on deck. Ships, too, were prizes. A captured merchantman might be stripped of valuables and burned, or, if seaworthy, absorbed into the pirate fleet. In such cases, the captain's share might include choice of furnishings or weapons, or even the right to claim the new vessel as his flagship. In this way, some captains built small flotillas, increasing both their prestige and their capacity for plunder. But while the captain's share was greater, so too were his expenses. He was expected to maintain his appearance, fine clothes, plumed hats, sashes, and boots to display authority. He often provided his own pistols and swords, and he might pay for repairs or upgrades to his cabin. In taverns, he was expected to spend lavishly, treating his men to drink and revelry. A miserly captain risked resentment, while a generous one secured loyalty. Wealth, therefore, was not simply hoarded but displayed, a performance of power and prosperity. The fleeting nature of plunder added another twist. Pirates lived in the moment, with little thought for tomorrow. The spoils of one voyage might vanish in weeks of debauchery ashore, squandered on drink, gambling, and companionship. Even captains, with their greater shares, often found themselves penniless between voyages. Stories abound of notorious captains who commanded fortunes at sea, only to die broke, their treasures lost, buried, or seized by authorities. Wealth was not permanent. It was a tide, rushing in and rushing out, as unpredictable as the sea itself. Yet the captain's reward was not measured only in gold. Prestige was a currency all its own. To stride into a port with a chest of silver, to wear silks torn from the East Indies, to be known as the man who commanded fortune itself, these were the trappings of greatness. For many captains, the true prize was not the coin counted in the hold, but the legend counted in whispers across taverns. Some captains sought to invest their shares, hoping to secure a future beyond piracy. A few bought plantations or ships, attempting to pass into respectability. Henry Morgan, once a buccaneer, became a governor of Jamaica, his wealth and fame granting him legitimacy. Others hoarded their treasure in hidden caches, dreaming of a day when they could retire in secret. But for every Morgan, there were a dozen Blackbeards, men who lived fast, spent lavishly, and died with their fortunes scattered. The balance of spoils also reinforced the captain's fragile authority. His larger share was tolerated only as long as it seemed fair. If he was seen to take too much, or to favor himself at the crew's expense, resentment brewed quickly. Pirate democracy meant that greed was a dangerous game. A captain who abused his privilege could find his men voting him out, marooning him on a barren isle, or worse. The history of piracy is littered with captains undone not by the navy, but by their own disillusioned crews. At sea, fortune was fleeting. A fat merchantman might yield a fortune, but weeks of bad luck could leave the hold empty. In such times, the captain bore the brunt of frustration. His men would mutter about his decisions, question his competence, and eye his larger share with suspicion. Thus, the very rewards of command carried the seeds of its downfall. Wealth was both a prize and a peril, and yet the dream of plunder remained irresistible. Men signed on not for wages but for shares, knowing that one successful voyage could change their lives. The captain embodied that dream, standing as the living symbol of fortune's favor. His greater share was not just a reward for leadership, it was the beacon that promised riches to those who followed him. So when you imagine the pirate captain's cabin, picture not just chests of glittering gold, but barrels of rum, bolts of silk, and crates of sugar. Imagine him lifting a jeweled goblet, not merely to drink, but to display his triumph. See him striding through a tavern, throwing coin to his men, laughter echoing as his reputation swells. His true reward was never only the treasure he carried, but the legend he wove around it, a legend that outlasted even the brightest gleam of gold. When we think of pirate captains, we imagine roaring battles, black flags, and treasure-laden holds. Yet their survival at sea often depended on something quieter, less romantic, and perhaps more surprising: diplomacy. For every cannon fired, there were a dozen negotiations whispered in the corners of taverns, behind closed doors in colonial mansions, or on the creaking decks of ships rocking at anchor. A pirate captain could not rely on force alone. The world was too vast, the dangers too many, for even the fiercest crew to survive without allies. Supplies ran short, ships needed repair, and safe harbors were rare. A captain who ignored the art of diplomacy often found himself stranded, hunted, and friendless. But those who mastered it could weave a network of strange friends and shadowy partners that allowed them to thrive in a hostile world. One of the most important relationships was with merchants. Despite laws forbidding trade with pirates, many merchants eagerly did so, lured by cheap goods and easy profit. Sugar, tobacco, spices, and stolen silks could be sold at a fraction of their true price, and there were always those willing to look the other way. A clever captain cultivated these ties, ensuring that when his ship limped into port, there were willing buyers waiting. Even colonial governors, sworn to uphold the king's law, sometimes turned pirate-friendly. Bribes, promises, or shared enemies persuaded them to grant pirates safe harbor. Nassau in the Bahamas became a notorious pirate haven, thanks in part to officials willing to profit from the trade. In Jamaica and elsewhere, governors winked at piracy as long as the silver flowed into their pockets. For a pirate captain, cultivating such allies was as important as winning battles at sea. Neutral ground also existed in the taverns and inns of bustling ports. Here, diplomacy took the form of whispered bargains over mugs of rum. Captains struck deals with smugglers, information brokers, and even rival pirates. One captain might agree to share intelligence about shipping routes, while another promised not to raid certain waters in exchange for free passage elsewhere. Though trust was always thin, these agreements could prevent bloodshed and increase profits. Among the most valuable allies were privateers, sailors who operated under government commission during wartime. The line between privateer and pirate was often blurred, and many captains moved freely between the two roles. A clever pirate captain might ally with a privateer flotilla, gaining temporary protection in exchange for shared loot or information. When peace returned and privateering commissions were revoked, many of these same men slid seamlessly into piracy themselves, bringing with them established networks of allies. But diplomacy was not limited to Europeans. In the Caribbean and along the American coast, pirate captains sometimes forged ties with indigenous peoples. These alliances offered safe anchorages, guides through treacherous waters, and even warriors to bolster pirate crews. In Madagascar and the Indian Ocean, pirates built relationships with local rulers, trading stolen goods for protection and supplies. Some captains even married into local families, blending their fates with foreign lands to ensure safety. The art of diplomacy extended even to enemies. Captains knew that reputation was valuable, but mercy could be useful too. A captain who ransomed prisoners rather than slaughtered them gained bargaining power. Governors and merchants sometimes preferred to negotiate with a pirate known for sparing lives, rather than risk confrontation with one who left only corpses in his wake. In this way, the careful balance of cruelty and clemency became a diplomatic strategy. Within the pirate community itself, diplomacy was constant. Though competition for plunder was fierce, captains often entered into loose confederacies, joining forces for major raids. The most famous of these was the Brethren of the Coast, a loose fraternity of buccaneers and pirates who cooperated in the Caribbean. At gatherings, captains debated, negotiated, and voted on matters of strategy. Alliances could be as fleeting as a single raid or endure for years, depending on fortune and trust. Yet these alliances were fragile, as quick to dissolve as they were to form. A promise broken, a share disputed, or a betrayal suspected could turn friend into foe overnight. Pirate captains knew that diplomacy was as dangerous as battle. One had to judge carefully whom to trust, when to bluff, and when to withdraw. The wrong word in the wrong ear could cost a captain his life. Despite the risks, diplomacy gave captains leverage. A captain who could summon allies at need, or who knew where to find safe harbor, had an advantage over one who stood alone. It allowed pirates to weave themselves into the very fabric of the world they sought to plunder, to play colonial powers against each other, and to carve spaces of survival in hostile seas. This quieter side of piracy is often forgotten in stories. We remember the roar of cannons, but not the soft clink of coin passed under a tavern table. We recall the black flags, but not the handshakes exchanged in the dim glow of lanterns. Yet for the captain, diplomacy was not weakness. It was strategy. It was the art of surviving when the guns fell silent, of ensuring that tomorrow offered another chance for plunder. So picture the pirate captain not just as a warrior, but as a negotiator. Imagine him in a smoky tavern, leaning across a table to seal a bargain with a wary merchant. See him in the governor's hall, offering a chest of silver in exchange for a blind eye. Picture him clasping hands with another pirate under the moonlight, promising cooperation before their paths diverge again. These were as real as any battle, and just as decisive. For in the end, the sea was too vast for any captain to master alone. It was alliances, bargains, and strange friendships that allowed them to endure. And though these pacts were often as fragile as the ships they sailed, they stitched together a web of survival that turned rogues into rulers of the waves, at least for a time. If the cannon was the pirate captain's enemy in battle, then the storm was his enemy in life. Battles were rare, but storms were constant, sudden, merciless, and often more deadly than any broadside. To be a pirate captain was to live under the shadow of the sky, forever watching the horizon for the flicker of black clouds or the restless shift of the wind. The sea itself was unpredictable. One day, calm and glittering beneath the sun. The next, a heaving monster, waves taller than a ship's masts. In such moments, all the authority, all the reputation, all the fear a captain commanded counted for nothing. Against a hurricane, men were equal, sailors, captains, and kings alike. But it was the captain who had to act, who had to hold the crew together when the very ocean seemed intent on swallowing them whole. The tools at his disposal were simple, yet precious. The compass, the log line, the sounding lead. Charts were crude, often based on rumor as much as fact, and weather prediction was little more than experience and instinct. A captain who could smell rain on the wind or sense a storm before it broke was worth his weight in gold. His men depended on him not only for courage, but for survival itself. Imagine the captain on deck at midnight, lantern light flickering across his face as the wind rises. He studies the horizon, the feel of the air, the roll of the ship beneath his boots. Should they press on toward their prize, or seek shelter? Should he trust to fortune, or to caution? The wrong choice could mean shipwreck, drowned men, and lost plunder. The right choice could mean salvation, and more loyalty from the crew. Storms tested a captain's authority like nothing else. When the sea roared and sails tore like paper, men looked to him with desperate eyes. His voice had to carry above the gale, his commands sharp, decisive, without hesitation. Reef the sails, lash the guns, secure the hatches. To falter, even for a heartbeat, was to invite chaos. A panicked crew could doom a ship faster than wind and wave. But storms were more than danger. They were opportunity. A cunning captain could use foul weather to his advantage. Chasing prey into the teeth of a gale, he might close the gap where a slower ship dared not follow. Or, with the sky darkening overhead, he might slip past naval patrols, hidden in the fury of rain and spray. To trust in one's luck, to gamble with storm and sea, was a hallmark of the boldest captains. Luck, in truth, was as much a part of command as skill. Sailors were superstitious folk, and a captain's fortune, or misfortune, became legend among them. A man who survived storms unscathed was thought blessed, favored by Neptune or the devil himself. His crew would follow him through fire and thunder, believing his luck a shield around them all. But a captain dogged by ill fortune, shipwrecks, losses, sickness, soon found whispers spreading. Bad luck could unravel authority as quickly as cowardice. Some captains embraced this, cultivating an aura of uncanny fortune. They boasted of survival in impossible odds, of storms that had spared them, of shipwrecks from which they alone had crawled. Every narrow escape became part of their legend, binding their men closer with the promise that fate itself favored them. Others tried to appease luck with ritual, nails driven into the mast for protection, offerings tossed into the sea, prayers muttered beneath their breath. But not all storms were storms of weather. Calms could be worse. To be trapped in the doldrums, the sea flat and glassy, the sails limp, the sun beating down without mercy, this tested a captain's patience and his men's sanity. Weeks without wind could mean empty barrels of water, dwindling food, and the slow creep of despair. Here again, the captain's voice was the anchor. He had to steady them, ration supplies, and keep discipline sharp. Without his hand, the doldrums could end in mutiny. Survival meant knowing when to fight the sea and when to yield. Some captains lashed their ships through storms, sails straining, hull groaning. Others ordered everything struck, letting the vessel ride the waves like a cork. Both choices carried risk, and the crew judged their captain by the outcome. To lose a mast, to founder on a reef, such failures were not blamed on the sea, but on the man who commanded. And yet, for all the terror of storms, for all the sleepless nights, and the prayers whispered in darkness, they also shaped the pirates' world. Storms scattered fleets, leaving ships vulnerable to capture. They drove merchants into harbours where pirates could pounce. They wrecked galleons on reefs, spilling treasure into shallow waters for the bold to claim. To be a pirate captain was to ride not only fortune's wheel, but the storm's fury, turning disaster into opportunity whenever possible. In this way, the storm became both enemy and ally. It was the crucible in which captains proved themselves, not with pistols drawn or swords raised, but with calm eyes and steady hands. Men who survived a storm with their captain at the helm loved him fiercely. Men who suffered loss under his command never forgave. So picture the pirate captain not in the smoke of battle, but in the howl of wind and spray. His coat is drenched, his voice hoarse from shouting, yet his grip on the wheel is iron. Lightning splits the sky, waves crash over the deck, but he does not waver. Around him, men cling to ropes, faces pale with fear. In that moment, more than in any battle, he is truly their captain, the one thin line between survival and the deep. And when dawn breaks, when the storm passes and the sea lies calm once more, the captain stands among his weary crew, drenched and hollow-eyed. They look at him, and in their gazes he reads the truth. They will follow him into hell itself, because he has led them through the storm. That too was a captain's luck, not only to survive, but to inspire belief that survival was inevitable under his command. When we imagine a pirate captain, our minds leap to thunderous broadsides, glittering treasure chests, and roaring speeches on the deck. Yet most of a captain's life was not lived in the smoke of cannon fire, nor the gleam of gold. The vast majority of his days were spent in the long, slow stretches of sea life, waiting, sailing, maintaining, and enduring. To be a pirate captain was to know that for every moment of glory there were weeks of routine. The ship itself was a floating world, and the captain had his place within it. His cabin was larger than any crewman's hammock, but far from luxurious. A wooden desk strewn with maps and charts, perhaps a shelf with a few battered books, a sea chest containing personal clothes and pistols. Lanterns swung from hooks, casting flickering light across the walls. The bed might be wider than a sailor's hammock, but the constant sway of the ship and the creak of timbers meant no one ever truly slept in comfort. From morning till night, the captain oversaw the rhythm of the ship. He set the course, approved repairs, checked provisions, and heard reports from the quartermaster. Every decision, when to change sails, when to steer closer to shore, when to risk an uncharted channel, was his to make. Though he bore the greatest authority, his life was not idle. It was filled with endless small choices, each carrying the weight of men's lives. The crew worked in watches, divided into shifts around the clock. Men climbed rigging, scrubbed decks, mended sails, and kept the guns in readiness. For the captain, these tasks were observed rather than performed, but his presence was never absent. A wise captain walked the deck, spoke with the men, encouraged them during long hours. This visibility mattered. Pirates expected their leaders not to vanish into their cabins, but to share in the daily life of the ship. Meals, too, were communal. While the captain often received better portions, a slice of salted beef less rancid, or an extra measure of rum, he did not dine in isolation like naval officers. Instead, he ate among his men, sharing their laughter and their groans at the state of the food. Hardtack, dried peas, salted meat, and whatever fresh supplies they could seize or buy made up the pirate diet. When a ship was newly plundered, there might be luxuries: wine, sugar, cheese, or exotic fruits. The captain was expected to enjoy them, yes, but also to share them, lest envy fester. Entertainment filled the quiet hours. Music was a constant companion. Many crews carried fiddles, drums, or pipes, and captains encouraged the playing of songs to keep spirits high. Storytelling was another favorite pastime. Tales of past voyages, ghostly legends of the sea, or ribald jokes told by firelight in the galley. Gambling with dice or cards consumed many evenings, with coins, trinkets, or rum as the stakes. The captain might join in, though he had to be careful. Winning too much could stir resentment, while losing too often might make him seem foolish. Discipline during these quiet stretches was another burden. Though pirates prized freedom, order was necessary to prevent chaos. A captain had to balance severity with leniency. Too much harshness, and his men would turn against him. Too much laxity, and the ship would fall into disrepair. Small infractions, sleeping at the watch, neglecting a task, were often handled by the quartermaster, but the captain's word was final. His ability to command respect in these daily matters mattered as much as in battle. Health was a constant worry. Scurvy, dysentery, infections, all stalked the crew. The captain was no doctor, but he was expected to secure remedies where possible, whether by raiding ships for citrus fruit, buying medicines in shady ports, or relying on the knowledge of seasoned sailors. A sickly crew meant no sails manned, no guns fired, no loot claimed. Thus, even in daily life, the captain's responsibility extended to the very bones and blood of his men. Yet there was camaraderie too. Pirate captains were not distant kings but elected leaders. They drank with their crews, joked with them, and shared their hardships. In the dull stretches of endless horizon, bonds were forged not through fear, but through fellowship. A captain who could laugh with his men during the monotony, who could play a hand of dice or join a song, was the one who could command them when the storm or the enemy arrived. These days between battles were also times of preparation. Sails were patched, weapons sharpened, powder kept dry. Captains oversaw drills, ensuring their crews were ready for the next chase. He might gather his officers to chart possible routes, seeking fat merchantmen or avoiding patrols. Planning was constant, for the sea punished idleness as harshly as cowardice. Some captains found the waiting unbearable. They craved action, steering recklessly into danger to relieve the monotony. Others embraced the quiet, using it to rest, to dream, or even to write. A few pirate captains kept journals, recording their thoughts or sketching crude maps. Though most of these writings are lost, they remind us that even men of blood and plunder lived long hours of silence. So, when you picture the daily life of a pirate captain, imagine not just the roar of battle, but the long stretches of sea and sky. Imagine him leaning on the rail, staring at the endless horizon, his thoughts drifting between fear of tomorrow and hope of fortune. Picture him in the galley, raising a mug of rum as his men sing a bawdy tune. See him at his desk by lantern light, tracing lines on a map, calculating risks with weary eyes. It was in these moments, not in the flash of cannons, that a captain truly proved himself. For any man could roar in the heat of battle, but only a true leader could endure the long, unglamorous weight of command in the quiet, grinding days between. That patience, that steady hand in the monotony of sea life, was the foundation upon which all legends were built. Power on a pirate ship was never absolute. Unlike the navies of kings, where captains held unquestioned authority, pirate captains shared their rule with the quartermaster and the Articles of Agreement. Yet when it came to justice, to deciding the fate of men who broke those sacred rules, the captain was often the one whose presence lent weight to judgment. To be a pirate captain was not only to lead in battle and chart a course, but also to sit as judge when tempers flared, when disputes boiled over, or when betrayal reared its head. Justice at sea was not a thing of courthouses and wigs. It was swift, harsh, and often brutal. But it was also necessary. A pirate crew, bound by nothing but trust, fear, and shared profit, could not survive without rules. And so, justice became one of the captain's heaviest burdens. The pirate code, those articles agreed upon at the start of a voyage, laid out the law. Every man had signed or sworn to them, binding himself to their terms. Loot must be divided fairly. Cowardice in battle was forbidden. Theft from a fellow crewmate was unforgivable. These rules were as sacred as scripture aboard a pirate ship, for without them, chaos would reign. When a man broke the code, it was the captain who called the crew together. On deck, beneath the sun or under flickering lanterns, the accused would be brought forward. The quartermaster often acted as prosecutor, while the crew jeered or muttered in judgment. Yet the captain's voice carried more weight than any other. He was expected to uphold the code, to protect the crew's honor, and to ensure fairness, even if his heart pulled him elsewhere. Some offences were minor. A sailor caught sleeping on his watch might be fined rum or lashed with a rope's end. A quarrel that spilled into blows might be settled by a duel on the sand, pistols or cutlasses at dawn, with the captain ensuring fairness. In these cases, justice was quick, and the ship soon returned to its rhythm. But graver crimes called for harsher punishment. Theft from the common chest, striking an officer, desertion, or cowardice in the heat of battle. These were betrayals of trust that could not be easily forgiven. Here, the captain's role was most vital. His face, stern and unyielding, embodied the law of the sea. One of the most dreaded punishments was marooning. A man found guilty of unforgivable betrayal might be set ashore on a barren island, with nothing but a pistol and a flask of water. It was a slow death sentence, though some few survived by luck or rescue. The act itself was a spectacle of judgment. The crew rowing the condemned ashore, the captain overseeing the grim ritual, his voice cold as he delivered the sentence. Flogging was another common sentence, though pirates used it sparingly compared to naval officers. A captain who flogged too freely risked rebellion. But when carried out, the sight was dreadful. Back bared, lashes striking until skin split, the crew watching in silence. The captain stood present, ensuring the punishment was neither too lenient nor too cruel. And then there was execution. Hanging a traitor from the yardarm or casting him overboard in irons was a measure reserved for the gravest crimes, mutiny, murder, or betrayal to the authorities. The captain had to be both judge and executioner, pronouncing the words that ended a man's life. These moments haunted even the hardest captains, for each execution risked sowing fear among the crew that tomorrow it could be them. Yet justice was not always bloody. A wise captain knew the value of mercy. Sparing a man, reducing a punishment, or granting forgiveness could strengthen loyalty as much as fear. Many captains balanced punishment with clemency, showing their men that justice was not cruelty, but order. The crew respected fairness, and a captain known for even judgment was trusted more deeply than one known only for severity. Discipline also extended beyond crime. Pirates, for all their chaos, expected fairness in plunder, equity in danger, and respect in daily life. A captain who ignored these values faced discontent, and discontent at sea was deadly. Mutiny lurked always in the background, the shadow of every judgment passed. To punish too harshly or too often was to invite whispers in the dark, knives in the night, or the sudden cry of rebellion. Famous captains handled justice in different ways. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, enforced discipline with a strict hand, maintaining a reputation for fairness but little tolerance for disorder. Blackbeard, in contrast, used fear theatrically, meting out punishments with dramatic flair to terrify both crew and foe alike. Calico Jack was said to have been lenient, which earned him affection, but may have contributed to his eventual downfall. For the pirate captain, justice was a balancing act. Too much cruelty, and he became a tyrant. Too much leniency, and the crew descended into chaos. Between these two cliffs, he walked a narrow line, holding the fate of men in his voice and in his hands. Picture it. The crew gathered on deck, the sea rolling beneath them, the accused standing shackled before the mast. The quartermaster speaks. The men murmur, but all eyes turn to the captain. His decision will bind them all. When he speaks, the murmurs fall silent. His words are not only law, but survival. For in a world without courts or kings, the pirate captain was judge, jury, and, when need demanded, executioner. And yet, when the day's grim work was done, when punishment had been carried out, the ship returned to its rhythm. The men sang once more, sails filled, the horizon beckoned. Justice had been served, the code upheld, and the fragile order of life at sea restored, at least until the next offence. For all their daring on the high seas, pirate captains knew that a ship could not live forever on wind and water alone. Sails frayed, food rotted, and men grew restless. And so, from time to time, even the most dreaded freebooters steered their vessels toward the lights of a harbour. Here, in the taverns and markets of the Caribbean, the pirate captain revealed a different side of his life. Half lord, half outlaw, always balancing glory with danger. Arriving in port was a spectacle in itself. The ship, battered and barnacled, slipped into harbour with her flag discreetly furled. No skull and crossbones now, but a neutral banner to mask her identity. The captain knew that governments hunted him, that spies lurked on the docks. Yet he also knew that merchants and innkeepers depended on pirate gold. For every governor who sought his neck, there was a tavern keeper who welcomed his coin. Stepping ashore, the captain was often greeted with awe. He carried himself differently from the common sailor. His coat might be finer, stitched with stolen silk or dyed a bold crimson. Pistols gleamed at his belt, and perhaps a cutlass rested at his hip. His beard was combed, his hat cocked just so. He walked with the swagger of a man who had stared death in the face and laughed. And in the eyes of the townsfolk, he was both hero and villain, a walking legend wrapped in flesh. The first destination was nearly always the tavern. Here, beneath the smoky rafters, the captain became a patron of revelry. Casks of rum were rolled out, fiddles scraped into lively tunes, and the drinking began. Gold spilled across the tables, coins snatched up by gamblers, musicians, and barmaids alike. The captain drank, yes, but he also performed, raising toasts, telling stories, weaving himself into the myth his men adored. His presence turned the tavern into a theatre, his voice carrying over the laughter and songs. Yet taverns were more than pleasure. They were places of business. Captains met with fences to sell stolen goods, with merchants willing to look the other way, and with smugglers who knew the hidden paths of trade. A chest of silver might be exchanged for weapons, powder, or exotic luxuries. Information was traded as readily as gold, whispers of fat galleons, of patrol routes, of rival crews. A clever captain listened more than he spoke, gathering knowledge that would guide his next voyage. But ashore, the captain was also vulnerable. Without his ship, without his cannons and sails, he was merely a man surrounded by enemies. Authorities hunted pirates relentlessly, and many a captain who swaggered too openly through port found himself clapped in irons before dawn. The wise captains chose their ports carefully, tolerant havens like Nassau or Tortuga, where corruption ran deep and officials were easily bribed. Even so, they kept a wary eye on every shadow, every stranger who lingered too long. Beyond the taverns, captains indulged in the luxuries denied them at sea. They bought fine clothes, rich foods, and sometimes jewelry for themselves or lovers. They visited gaming houses, throwing dice or cards with reckless abandon. They consorted with women, whether in fleeting trysts or in longer entanglements that sometimes ended in scandal. For a brief span of days, they lived not as outlaws, but as kings, lords of misrule, ruling with coin instead of cannon. Yet money burned fast. Pirate wealth was as fleeting as sea foam. What was plundered one week might be gone the next, spent on drink, gambling, and revels. A captain had to decide how much to indulge and how much to save for the ship's upkeep. New sails, new powder, food, and fresh water all cost dearly. A captain who squandered too much risked setting out again with an ill-prepared ship, and his men would not forgive him if fortune turned against them. There was also the delicate matter of diplomacy. A pirate captain often met with officials in secret, governors, magistrates, even naval officers, men who could be bribed to look the other way. Some captains, like Henry Morgan, even became entangled in politics, blurring the line between outlaw and privateer. A word spoken in the right ear, a chest of coin delivered discreetly, could mean safe passage or months of protection. But betrayal was always a risk. Today's ally might be tomorrow's executioner. Still, for all the peril, the lure of shore was irresistible. For the captain, it was a chance to remind himself that he was more than a storm-tossed figure at the wheel. On land, he felt the solidity of stone beneath his boots, smelled the spice of market stalls, heard the clamour of life beyond the sea. It was intoxicating, a reminder of the world he risked all to plunder, and of the life he could never fully return to. Some captains dreamed in these moments ashore of retirement, to buy a small estate, to live as a gentleman, to leave the sea behind. A few managed it, men like Morgan, who rose from piracy to knighthood. But most spent their riches as swiftly as they earned them, drawn back again and again to the horizon. For them, the land was only ever a brief interlude, a stage upon which to play the part of lord before the sea reclaimed them. And so, when the casks were empty, when the gold was spent, when the governor's spies grew too bold, the captain returned to his ship. His boots clattered up the gangplank, his men followed in ragged cheer, and the harbour lights dwindled astern. The taverns fell silent, the streets forgot his tread, and the sea welcomed him back with open arms. Ashore he might have played the king, but at sea he was again what he truly was, a pirate captain, bound to the waves, forever hunted, forever free. If the sea was the stage, then pirate captains were its actors, flamboyant, terrifying, and unforgettable. They knew that survival was not just about guns and sails, but about reputation. A captain's name could open doors, close ports, terrify enemies into surrender, or rally men to his cause. And so, beyond the reality of command, pirate captains became masters of myth-making. They lived not only as men, but as legends in the making. Take Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. His very appearance was theatre. He braided slow-burning fuses into his great black beard, so that in battle his face was wreathed in smoke and sparks, a living demon. He strapped pistols across his chest, wore a broad hat, and carried himself with towering menace. Yet those who sailed with him often remarked that he was not the bloodthirsty madman of rumour, but a calculating strategist who used terror as a weapon. Blackbeard understood that if men surrendered without a fight, fewer lives were lost, and more treasure was gained. His legend was his sharpest cutlass. Then there was Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, perhaps the most successful pirate of them all. Where others cultivated savagery, Roberts cultivated grandeur. He dressed in fine silks, carried a jeweled sword, and demanded discipline from his men. He sailed with multiple ships under his command, and took more than 400 prizes in his career. Roberts represented the other side of piracy's coin. Not wild chaos, but organized ambition. His infamy lay not in cruelty, but in relentless success. Calico Jack Rackham, on the other hand, was remembered as much for his companions as for his deeds. His flag, the skull with crossed cutlasses, became one of the most iconic symbols of piracy. But his legacy endures largely because of the women who sailed with him, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. These two, dressed as men in battle and feared as fighters, shattered expectations of their age. Rackham himself was less formidable than others, but by association, his name entered legend. Some captains became infamous through acts of savagery. François l'Olonnais, the French buccaneer, was said to have cut out the hearts of prisoners and eaten them, his cruelty echoing across the Caribbean. Though perhaps exaggerated, such tales cemented his reputation as a figure of terror. Sailors whispered his name like a curse, proof that infamy could be as potent as fame. Others, like Henry Morgan, blurred the line between pirate and statesman. Morgan began as a privateer with legal sanction to plunder Spanish possessions, but his raids were so audacious, sacking Panama, burning towns, that he earned both fortune and notoriety. Unlike most pirates, he lived to see respectability, knighted by the English crown. Yet even as Sir Henry Morgan, the shadow of the pirate clung to him, proof that infamy could be transmuted into power. But not all captains crafted their own legends. Some were shaped by the tales told of them, distorted and magnified as stories spread from tavern to tavern. A skirmish at sea became a grand battle. A single act of cruelty became a career of bloodshed. In an age when literacy was rare, oral tradition carried these stories, and sailors, merchants, and fearful townsfolk embroidered them with each retelling. Pirate captains became larger than life, their deeds magnified by rumor. Symbols helped fuel these myths. The Jolly Roger, in its many variations, was the greatest of them. A black flag with a skull, an hourglass, crossed bones or cutlasses. It told sailors that they faced not just men, but outlaws beyond mercy. Captains each designed their own banners, and in doing so, they branded themselves. Roberts's black flag with a skeleton toasting death, Rackham's skull and cutlasses, Blackbeard's skeletal demon stabbing a heart. These were emblems of legend. A flag on the horizon could send a merchant crew into panic before a single shot was fired. Infamy was not only for enemies, it was currency among pirates themselves. A captain with a fearsome reputation attracted bold men eager for plunder. His name promised riches, adventure, and glory. In the cramped quarters of a tavern, a whisper that Blackbeard sought men for his crew might draw volunteers in droves. Reputation built loyalty as much as shares of treasure. Of course, legends cut both ways. Infamy drew attention from kings and empires, and the greater a captain's reputation, the more fiercely authorities hunted him. The downfall of many captains was sealed not by betrayal or mutiny, but by the sheer weight of their names. Blackbeard fell beneath the guns of the Royal Navy. Roberts was struck down in battle off Africa, and Rackham was captured in Jamaica, his infamy securing his noose. The very legends that made them powerful also made them irresistible targets. And yet, centuries later, it is the legends that endure. In the flickering lantern light of taverns long vanished, in the yellowed pages of old broadsheets, the stories of these captains took root. They became archetypes: the terrifying demon, the dashing commander, the cruel butcher, the gentleman raider. Even now, their images ripple through history, shaping how we think of piracy itself. To be a pirate captain was to command men, ships, and battles, but it was also to command stories. A man who died obscure might be forgotten, but one who crafted a legend lived forever. Their names are still spoken, their flags still fly in our imaginations. And though the truth was often harsher, dirtier, and shorter than the tales, it is the infamy that remains, The shadow of sails on the horizon, the glint of pistols at dusk, the echo of laughter in a storm. In the end, the legends of pirate captains remind us of this, that history is not just what happened, but what people believed happened. And in the beliefs of sailors, merchants, and frightened townsfolk, captains became eternal. They may have died by rope or by cannon, but in the stories told after dark, they still live, fearsome, flamboyant, unforgettable. For every pirate captain who rose to glory, there came a reckoning. The sea was generous with opportunity, but it was merciless in the end. Few captains grew old, and fewer still died peacefully. Their lives, lived in defiance of kings and empires, ended as violently as they had lived, by musket, by cannon, by betrayal, or by the hangman's noose. To wear the mantle of pirate captain was to carry with it not only wealth and fame, but also the near certainty of a bloody or shameful end. Some fell in battle, cut down in the roar of cannon and the smoke of musket fire. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, met such a fate in 1718 at Ocracoke Inlet. Hunted by the Royal Navy, he fought like a demon, pistols blazing, cutlass swinging. It took 5 musket balls and more than 20 cuts to bring him down. Even then, legend says he fought on until his lifeless body fell to the deck. His severed head was hung from a Navy sloop's bowsprit, a warning to all who dared follow his path. Blackbeard's death was gruesome, but it ensured his immortality in story. Others met their end in quieter but no less deadly confrontations. Bartholomew Roberts, the Black Bart, who had captured more ships than any other, fell to a single cannon shot in 1722. Struck in the throat, he died instantly. His crew, unwilling to see him dishonored by capture, cast his body into the sea, dressed in his finest crimson coat. For a man who had lived as a symbol of order and grandeur, the ocean became his grave, unmarked but eternal. Some captains did not fall to cannon fire, but to the betrayals of their own men. Pirate crews, though democratic in spirit, were also volatile. A captain who lost his crew's trust could be deposed in an instant. Sometimes this meant exile, other times it meant death. Mutiny was a constant shadow. Charles Vane, once a fierce and feared commander, found himself abandoned by his men after a string of failures. They marooned him, and when he tried to start anew, he was captured by the authorities. His fate was sealed not by the Navy, but by his own crew's loss of faith. And then there was the noose. Of all deaths, hanging was the most common for pirate captains. When captured, they were paraded before courts eager to make examples of them. Trials were swift, sentences predetermined. In London, Port Royal, or Boston, gallows stood ready to display their bodies as warnings. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged in Jamaica in 1720, his lover Anne Bonny supposedly mocking him in his cell with the words, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." His body, like many others, was displayed in chains, left to rot in the sun as carrion for crows. Executions were not merely punishment, they were theatre. Towns gathered to watch as notorious captains were marched to their deaths, ropes swinging in the breeze. Their last words were recorded in broadsheets, exaggerated and spread to every port. Some went bravely, defiant to the end. Others begged for mercy, their reputations shattered in their final moments. The state used these deaths to crush piracy, to remind sailors and townsfolk alike that defiance ended in disgrace. Even those who escaped the gallows often found no peace. A few were pardoned, like Henry Morgan, who traded his pirate flag for a governor's sash. But most who tried to settle found themselves hunted, hounded, or betrayed. Riches melted away, taverns turned cold, and once loyal allies sold them out for coin. A pirate captain could command terror at sea, but on land he was often just another fugitive. It is striking how swiftly the tide could turn. One year, a captain might stride ashore with gold in his pockets, celebrated in taverns, his flag feared across oceans. The next, he might dangle from a gibbet, his body left to bleach in the sun. Piracy allowed men to rise quickly, but it cast them down just as fast. Their careers were meteors, bright, brief, and always destined to burn out. Yet even in their falls, captains shaped their own legends. Blackbeard's violent death cemented his myth as the devil of the seas. Roberts's dignified end preserved his image as a commander of rare discipline. Rackham's execution bound his name forever to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, ensuring his story lived beyond his failures. The Nooses, the Betrayals, the cannon fire. These were not just endings, but transformations from men into myths. The fall of pirate captains also marked the fall of piracy itself. By the 1720s and 30s, the Golden Age of Piracy was drawing to a close. Navies had grown stronger, trade routes were more heavily guarded, and the pirate havens of Nassau and Tortuga had been crushed. Captains were hunted without mercy, and their executions became symbols of victory for the empires they had defied. Each noose tightened not only around a man's neck, but around the very throat of piracy. Still, there is a strange romance in their downfalls. We remember the defiance, the last stands, the gallows speeches. We forget the terror, the hunger, the betrayals. Their deaths, no matter how ignoble, became stitched into the tapestry of legend. They remind us that piracy was never a path to safety or peace. It was a bargain struck with fate, where glory burned bright and death loomed near. To be a pirate captain was to live knowing the end would come, by musket ball, by cannon fire, by mutiny, or by the hangman's rope. And yet they lived it anyway. Perhaps that is why we still speak their names. Not because they won in the end, but because they dared to live knowing they would almost certainly lose. When the sails of piracy finally faded from the horizon, the men who had once commanded terror at sea were long gone, hanged at the gallows, cut down in battle, or swallowed by the waves. Yet their names remained, whispered in taverns, sung in ballads, and eventually printed in broadsheets and books. The pirate captain, though dead in flesh, lived on in legend. And in those legends, reality was reshaped, exaggerated, and softened until it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. The reality of pirate captains was hard, dirty, and brief. They were not immortal demons or gallant rogues, but men of contradictions. They dealt in blood and plunder, but also in leadership and negotiation. They could be ruthless one day and generous the next. They fought hunger, disease, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Life on a ship was cramped and filthy, filled with toil rather than treasure. Yet when stories of these men spread beyond the Caribbean, their flaws were smoothed away, their hardships forgotten, and their worst cruelties sometimes turned into daring feats. Taverns were the first breeding grounds of myth. Sailors fresh from the sea spun tales of their captains, magnifying their deeds with each retelling. A small skirmish became a great naval battle. A narrow escape became proof of supernatural luck. Blackbeard's habit of tying fuses in his beard became, in the mouths of storytellers, evidence that he was the devil incarnate. The ordinary became extraordinary, until the captains themselves seemed larger than life. Pamphlets and newspapers in Europe amplified the process. Publishers quickly realized that pirate stories sold. They took fragments of truth, ships captured, battles fought, and wove them into thrilling accounts filled with embellishment. The reading public, far removed from the realities of Caribbean heat and hunger, devoured these tales. To them, pirate captains were not criminals, but adventurers, men who thumbed their noses at kings and carved their own fortunes. Reality bent under the weight of fascination. In time, literature and theatre further transformed these men. The grim brutality of Roberts or the cruelty of l'Ollonais faded, replaced by images of dashing sea rogues with a code of honor. By the 18th and 19th centuries, ballads and plays painted pirates as swashbucklers, Dangerous, yes, but also romantic, even noble. They became symbols of freedom, rebellion, and adventure, rather than of hunger, violence, and death. And so, myth overtook reality. The pirate captain became a figure of escapism, a fantasy of freedom from laws and lords. In the collective imagination, he was always young, bold, and defiant, sailing with a black flag snapping overhead and treasure glittering in his hold. The harsh truth that most pirate captains died young, penniless, and broken was forgotten, swept away in the tide of storytelling. Yet the reality lingers if one looks closely. Behind the legends are glimpses of men struggling against the currents of their age. Blackbeard was not a demon, but a clever tactician who used fear as a weapon. Roberts was not a playboy adventurer, but a strict commander whose discipline made him formidable. Rackham, far from a great leader, is remembered largely because of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The truth is often stranger and smaller than the myth. Still, perhaps there is a reason the myths endure. They speak to something universal, the longing for freedom, the allure of danger, the thrill of defiance. To imagine oneself a pirate captain is to imagine stepping outside the bounds of ordinary life, to live unchained, even if only for a moment. Myths give us the pirate we want, not the one who truly was. And so, centuries later, the pirate captain sails on, not in reality, but in imagination. His flag flies in stories, his name whispered by children at bedtime, his image stamped on coins, novels, and films. He survives not as flesh and blood, but as legend, eternal in the way only stories can be. When you close your eyes tonight and picture a pirate captain, you may see a tall man with a fearsome beard, pistols across his chest, his eyes glowing like embers. You may hear the crash of waves and the creak of rigging, smell the salt spray and the smoke of battle. That image, vivid and eternal, is not reality, but it is what makes the captain immortal. For though the nooses tightened, though the cannons thundered, though the seas themselves claimed them, the stories lived on. And in stories, they never truly die. And so, dear listener, our sails come down and the lanterns grow dim. We've walked the decks of pirate ships, shared the burdens of command, and watched captains rise into legend before falling to their fate. Some led with fear, others with cunning, but all lived lives so fierce and fleeting that their names outlasted them. If you enjoyed drifting through these tales tonight, I invite you to stay aboard for more. There are still countless stories in the holds of history, taverns filled with laughter, seas haunted by shadows, and lives lived on the edge of freedom. You can join me again by subscribing to Sleepy Pirate Tales. And if you'd like to keep the voyage alive, leave a comment with the name of your favorite pirate captain, or perhaps one you'd like to hear about next. Until then, may the seas be calm, may your dreams be adventurous, and may the legends of the past keep you company as you drift off to sleep. Good night, shipmate.